G'day everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to take you through how I built this solid white oak dog crate. Now, you might be asking yourself, why on earth would you build a dog crate out of solid white oak? I'm glad you asked. My brother-in-law came around the other day with a stack of white oak that he can't keep with him and asked me if I'd make a dog box out of it. And who am I to say no? I haven't gone super fancy here, but I'm still really happy with the results. It looks simple and elegant. And it's been a good excuse to brush up on some woodworking skills that I haven't had a chance to in recent times. With all that said, let's get into the build. Unfortunately, I don't have any real lumber storage to speak of, so this pile of gold is gonna sit on the floor until it all gets used up. I'm going to start off making the walls of the crate, so the first port of call is to cut some of the lengths down to a rough height on a drop saw. Now this timber is pretty bowed, so I make sure to cut it with several shallow passes to help prevent the wood from binding on the blade. With all the boards for the sides cut to rough length, it's time to clean them up. So I take them over to the jointer and start off by planing one face and one edge. Luckily, when the timber is cut to this size, the bow was far less noticeable, so it was pretty straightforward to plane. Next, I need to reduce the boards to final thickness, so I start off by arranging them from thickest to thinnest and start planing the thickest ones first. I've got to say, while these combo planer thicknesses have their drawbacks, they're a godsend for a small workshop and I love using this one. The final step to cleaning up these boards is to take them over to the table saw and clean up the final edge, giving us two perfect edges ready to glue together. Now it's time to glue the first side panel up, and I'm pretty excited because I splashed out and bought these brand new parallel clamps. And I've got to say, I didn't see what all the fuss was about until I actually got to use them for myself. And now I can see what all the fuss was about. They are in fact most excellent and well worth the money. You'll notice I'm not using any dowels or biscuits or dominoes, not that I have a domino, and this is because they're really only needed for alignment, and I figured this glue up was pretty manageable and that just adding some clamps across the joins would probably be enough. Having said that, I did need to get out the hammer at the end and give the boards a little bit of a gentle persuasion. With the sides done, I can now move over to making the top and the bottom. And I know what you're thinking, hey Chris, aren't they basically just the same thing? Well, no, they're not. The sides are big, flat, vertical pieces of wood, and the top and the bottom are big, flat, horizontal pieces of wood. Okay, fine, they're the same, let's move on. The pieces of timber I used for the top and the bottom were actually much thicker than what I used for the sides, and I didn't really fancy planing down 12mm or half an inch of wood, so I needed to resaw them. Ideally, you'd do this on a bandsaw, but mine doesn't really have the right blade and generally isn't set up for resawing. So what I did was to use my cabinet saw to rip each board on both edges, having my blade raised up so that with both cuts made, there'd still be around 10mm or half an inch of meat left in the middle. I could then take the board over to the bandsaw, which was happy enough to finish off the resaw job. As you can see, this has left a rough part in the middle of each board, but that's fine because I need to take them over to the thicknesser to finish off anyway. One thing I forgot to do with the last glue up was to put blue tape over the clamps. This isn't a big deal, but it helps prevent the glue from reacting with the metal of your clamps, which can in turn transfer onto your timber, which can be annoying to sand out. So just like before with the side panels, I glue and clamp the top and bottom panels using the small F clamps to help keep the boards aligned. All the panels glued up, it's time to cut them to final size. And while I could have done this with a straight edge and my skill saw, I wanted as good a finish as I could get. So I borrowed my neighbour's track saw, which not only made nicer cuts, but was also a heck of a lot easier to measure and align. I want to attach the bottom panel to the sides with a stopped dado join. And to cut the dado, I'm going to use a 19mm or 3/4 of an inch pattern bit in my router. I clamp a straight piece of wood to the side panel along the line of where I want the dado, and this acts as a guide for the pattern bit to follow. Then it's just a matter of routing along the guide, making sure to stop roughly 12mm or ½ an inch before the end of the panel, so we have a stop dado instead of a through dado. I'm both excited and a little bit nervous about this next step, as it involves using my dado stack for the very first time. I need to cut a rabbet in the back of both side panels to recess the back panel. And so I set up the stack for a 19mm or 3/4 of an inch cut and set the cut to around 6mm or 1/4 of an inch deep. I clamp a sacrificial fence to my rip fence and move the fence over until it just kisses the dado stack. Then we're good to go, and I can run the panels through and cut the rabbets for my back panel. Now I'm using these fancy 270-degree hinges to allow the doors to open and fully fold back against the sides. And to have the look I want, I'm going to need to recess them flush into the sides. Because we need to do this 4 times, we want to make sure we do it exactly the same each time, which means we need a jig. So starting with a scrap piece of 7mm or 1/4 inch ply, I lay out the sides of the hinge with some scrap pieces of wood. These will ultimately be the edge guides for the pattern router bit to follow. Before we lay out the back part of the hinge, however, we need to consider that the hinge will not only be recessed into the face of the sides, but it will also be recessed into the edge. So we must also recess the hinge into the edge of our pattern by the thickness of the hinge. One handy way to set the depth of your router to that of a hinge is to lay out the hinges on a flat surface, place the router on them, and then plunge until the bit touches the flat surface. Sandwiching our 7mm ply between some scrap pieces of wood to give us more surface area, I roughly route out where the hinge should be recessed. It's not super important if you go over the lines here, because ultimately they won't be guiding the router when the jig is finished. We're now ready to put the jig together. Making sure the hinge is sitting in the recess we just made, we can place our scrap pieces around the sides and back of the hinge, making for a nice snug fit. Then we can use CA glue and kicker to glue each piece in place. It's probably fine to rely on the glue alone, but just to be on the safe side, I drove a few brad nails in from the back to make sure everything is nice and secure. The final thing to do with the jig is to use the pattern bit to cut out the 7mm ply where the hinge goes, using the pieces we just glued on as the guide. I'm using a router bit here the same radius as the corner of the hinges, which is about 12mm or ½ an inch. Fits like a glove. Now we can simply clamp the jig in place, set the router to the appropriate depth, and route to the pattern. Remember how I said we needed to recess the edges as well? Well, we can easily repurpose our jig to do that too. All we need to do is to tack another scrap piece of wood to the bottom of the jig, which will give us something to help clamp the jig onto the side panel. Then with the modified jig, we can simply clamp it in place and route the edge of the side panel. We don't even need to adjust the depth of the router. And as you can see, the hinges now fit perfectly inside their recesses. With our sides complete, we can move on to finishing the bottom panel. And the first thing we need to do here is to cut it to its final depth, which will be 18 mils or 3/4 of an inch less than that of the sides, because I want to leave room for the back panel. Then we can move on to cutting some notches in the front of the panel to come over the stopped part of the dados in the side panels. I'm using a marking gauge to work out where to cut, as this severs the wood fibres where I'm cutting, which should give me a cleaner cut. And then I use a small Japanese pull saw to cut the notches out. And finally, we need a couple of strips of wood to act as supports on the top of the box, so I ripped 2 down to about 80mm or just over 3 inches on the cabinet saw. Alright, sanding time! Oh wait, I hate sanding. Anyway, I give all the panels a sand down to about 240 grit before assembly, as it's a lot easier to sand them before they're all put together. With the sanding out of the way, I do a quick dry fit to make sure I haven't mucked anything up. And let me tell you, it's really hard to get these 3 panels together by yourself. But with the help of a trusty clamp, I got it together and it looked great. I'm going to attach the 2 top supports with pocket holes. So the last thing to do before assembly is to get out my trusty Craig pocket hole jig and drill a few holes in each end of the 2 supports. Beginning the assembly, I add a bead of glue to both dados, and learning from my previous attempt at the dry fit, I worked out that it's much easier to put together on its side. When attaching the top supports, I make sure the pocket holes are on the top so they will be hidden by the actual top when it's added. Note that I've offset the back support by 18mm or 3/4 of an inch to accommodate the back panel later on. And to make sure things are nice and square, I add some of these handy dandy right angle clamps to the corners. For the back panel, I'm using a piece of 18mm or 3/4 of an inch birch ply, as it's more stable and less likely to move. To attach the back, I start by running 2 thin beads of glue along the rabbets of the side panels. I then use brad nails to skewer the back to both the top support and the bottom panel, and then I add a few clamps for good measure. Now we can move on to finishing the top, and we need to start off with sanding to about 240 grit. But nobody wants to watch sanding, so let's move on to the next part. I want to add a nice chamfer to the bottom of the lid, so I load up a chamfer bit in my trim router and route the front and both sides of the top. I do this in about 3 passes, gradually increasing the size of the chamfer for each pass. Moving on to the doors. These are going to be a simple frame with dowels instead of a central panel. I start off by ripping a bunch of strips of wood down to 60mm or roughly 2 1/3 of an inch, and these will be used for the rails and stiles of the door. Then using my crosscut sled, I cut all the rails and stiles to their final lengths. I need to cut some mortises in these parts of the doors, but I have two issues. The first is the way my router is set up, the guide is not particularly useful and leaves a massive big gap there. But the next problem is, even if my guide wasn't like that, these pieces of wood are pretty small and don't offer a whole lot of support. So what I'm going to do is make a sort of cradle and pack it out. So I'll have a big chunk of wood on one side, another on the other side, and something underneath to have it all flush, and that will make the thickness big enough that the router sits in the right place, but also enough surface area that the router won't be tempted to rock. Then I can clamp it in the vise and route the mortises. With the jig made, I add a couple of pencil lines to it so I know where to start and stop the router. Then I can proceed to route the mortises using several passes until I get to my desired depth. Then I can repeat the process for all 4 stiles, cutting a total of 8 mortises. The router bit I used to make the mortises was a 1/4 inch bit, so now I need to make a tenon on each end of each rail to fit those 1/4 inch mortises. To make the mortises, I'm going to use my dado stack in my cabinet saw, and to begin with I use a scrap piece of wood to ensure I get a good fit without ruining one of my rails. I start by making an initial pass on each side, purposefully too shallow. I then test the tenon on one of the mortises for fit. Then I'll go back to the table saw and adjust the blade height slightly, repeating the process until I snuck up on the perfect fit. Then with the blade at the perfect height, I can run each rail through, cutting the sides of a tenon on each end. And the ends of the tenons are cut in exactly the same way. You may have noticed that I've made square tenons to fit into rounded mortises. Well, to fix that, I simply use a file to round over the edges of each tenon. And the end result is a pretty sweet fit. Next up, we need to drill holes in the rails for the dowels. I clamped all the rails together to make sure I got the same measurement across all 4 of them before taking them over to the drill press. On the drill press, I clamped a piece of scrap wood in place as a fence so that when I placed the rail on, the drill was perfectly centered on it. Then I could slide the rail across and drill all 3 holes of each rail. I'm using a 12mm brad point bit here as they're a bit more accurate, and I have my drill press depth stop set to about 30mm or just over 1 inch. We have one more thing left to do before we can glue the doors up. If we attach the doors to our hinges right now, the hinges would offset the doors, so we need to route a small channel in the 2 stiles that will be attached to the hinges. Luckily, we can simply reuse our router jig we made earlier, adjusting the depth of the router accordingly. After quickly cutting the dowels for the doors, it was finally time to glue those doors together. And while I was pretty excited to get them all glued up, the process was a bit cumbersome. I basically glued the dowels in place first, and then I added each stile one at a time, and when everything was in place I double checked for square with my set square. While the doors are drying, it's time to attach the lid. But I figured it'd be easier to apply finish to the carcass first, as it will be a little easier to get to everything before the lid is attached. I'm using Rubio Monocoat here as it's super easy to apply, only needs one coat and gives a beautiful matte to satin finish. Now the grain of my entire cabinet is all parallel, so I shouldn't really need to worry about wood movement, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to use a few techniques to help with this issue. First up, I'm going to screw through the top supports into the lid, but I'm going to drill oversized holes in the supports, and then I'm going to use a washer to cover those holes, and that should account for a small amount of movement. I'm also going to use some angle brackets to attach the sides to the lid, and similarly to the previous step, the holes in the brackets are larger than the screws, again leaving some room for wood movement. You want to be really careful drilling into the sides so you don't go all the way through. A bit of blue tape is a good idea here. The great thing about all the previous work of recessing the hinges into the wood is now there's no alignment to be done. We can simply put them in place, pre-drill the screw holes and screw them in place. I'm using a self-centering drill bit here, and this has the added benefit that it won't drill holes deeper than the sides, so no blue tape needed here. And the same thing goes for the doors. Because of the recesses for the hinges, they just slot in place. Ha, it's a beautiful thing. So after drilling and screwing the doors in place, all it was needed was to add some finish to the doors, attach the hardware, and we're done. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed building it. At the point of recording this, I haven't actually seen the dog on this yet, so I'm actually really excited to see that myself. And if luck is with me, you've probably already seen that earlier in the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'll see you in the next build.